Hija notloch, tosepan, ma tinechkakis. Many are beginning to become awake in this prophetic time and space, in stride with the movement of the stars in relation to the precession of the equinox, as we near the end of this age, and are now beginning to question the very nature of this manufactured matrix in which they have been brought up in. This manufactured matrix I'm speaking of is the civilized world, the Mason's cube. Waking up is part of one's progression, but there is a consequence when one awakens from their deep slumber, beginning to become lucid, without the original, necessary, natural, ancient insight and context one's traditional, ancient, original, indigenous oral history, language, stories, wisdom, tradition, and customs provide that illuminate to one the purpose of life in this realm. How and why we are here, how this place came to be, how we came to be. This plane's full history from the very first age, and most importantly, that would clearly express and articulate how one is to properly relate to and with the various organisms around oneself that make up the whole of one's own natural ecoregion and biosphere, in sequence with the seasons and in ebb and flow with the rest of the collective interdependent natural world. Without this context that serves as the cipher to this realm, one will find oneself in a great labyrinth, a hall of illusions, easily guided and persuaded to and fro wherever the unseen hand guided one. Colonization, the main and integral mechanism of the construct of civilization by which sustains civilized living pan-generationally, has stolen, robbed, and purposefully, systematically withheld pan-generationally the ancient and necessary original insight and context needed for the descendants of colonized, enslaved, oppressed, suppressed, and subjugated plebeian populations to successfully return to their true power, true health, true wealth, and optimum state, which is fully predicated upon one's reunion with the natural world as interdependent, symbiotic aspects of one's natural ecology in this natural living, breathing world. And through systematic colonial indoctrination, miseducation, eugenics, trauma, religion, media, genetic and cultural assimilation has created a barrier, a disconnect, a deep incepted, supplanted, manufactured shame, and an inability to relate or to want to relate oneself with one's own ancient, original hunter-gatherer ancestors, and instead has purposefully and systematically manufactured and created joinder between our people and our people's colonizers in all their various many shapes, forms, empires, and colonies throughout the ages. One must understand the surviving Kinemetsin Weitlachame giant Atlantean kingship bloodlines who made up the ruling class, elite, and royalty of the Tepetlaltitlan, the civilized stone cities of the Southwest, Mexico, Central and South America, like that of Tikal, of Teotihuacan, of Tenochtitlan, did not consider themselves the same race as the whole of the enslaved, colonized, Masehuali, or plebeian slave citizen classes which made up the majority of the Inca, Aztec, Toltec, Maya, and Olmec population, irregardless of how much blood of our people's second age lineage they carried within their veins through the systematic intermingling and breeding practices with those of the second age lineages. This is paramount to understand, paramount. You see, my relations, even if a person in a civilized or colonized state truly has good intention and a good heart and loves this earth as much as she can, loves the plants, loves the animals, loves the trees as much as she can in her current state, because she lacks the ancient and original context and insight in which ancient and original pre-civilization language, oral history, wisdom, custom, and tradition clearly articulate. She will not know or understand how she is to express that love to the earth, to the animals, to the plants, the trees, the water, the lands, and the whole of the collective organisms who make up the entirety of her natural environment in a way that does not harm them, that does not stifle their progress on our soul's journey, that does not inhibit them from experiencing the natural circumstance in which they incarnated into to experience to complete them, so that they may fulfill their own respective Teypohs'weepeehl, their sacred incarnative function, and be able to then continue moving on to more complex and greater realms, planes, shapes, forms, expressions, and experiences of life in which await them. You see, it is this ancient and original natural context and insight which is contained in all ancient pre-civilization, original indigenous hunter-gatherer tradition, oral history, language, and wisdom that allows one to understand how, when, and why, and what particular and differentiating algorithms of experiences one must generate and prescribe to the various organisms around oneself that create the various natural circumstances that will ultimately complete them and aid them in the fulfillment of their own particular Teypohs'weepeehl, or sacred incarnative purpose and function. And facilitating this process for them is what will ultimately complete us as well, and aid in the fulfillment of our own Teypohs'weepeehl, or sacred incarnative function, and the facilitation of our soul growth, our healing, and the progression on our own soul journey. You see, this was the original instructions, in which all original indigenous human beings whom were created and left unmolested in their purity and power kept and lived by, and what was and is the source of our genius, our power, our potency, and balance. Without this adherence to the highest natural laws, and without the cipher by which ancient, natural, original context, insight, oral history, and wisdom provide, there can be no balance, no peace, no oneness, and no harmony in or with one's own natural environment, regardless of one's intention. As the subtle complexities of the many vast layers of this realm and the endless natural circumstances and realms and experiences contained within its own natural matrix and laws are vastly more complex, poetic, morphogenic, and oceans more deep than the very height and pinnacle of civilized man's barbaric golden era theosophical and philosophical expressions, which one will find may only lead one in circles, never back to center. So for millennia, my people have witnessed civilized man, the descendants of the slaves, subjects, servants, and colonized populations of the Civilized giants and their descendants, still caught in the Civilized's cube, still seeking more and more endless, never-ending, further inflaming, complex, temporary solutions each year to combat the symptoms of the ever-growing problems in which require no other remedy to end their systematic, systemic, and pan-generational chronic manifestation other than to simply let go of the very construct in which has always and will always create them. Yet it is fear, ultimately, that will not allow civilized man to let go of his own chains, to let go of all in which afflicts him. This fear of letting go of all of which in he has entrapped and pan-generationally exploits to sustain his self-destructive way of death, which keeps him from having to walk back out into the realm of reality, back out into one's own natural and inherent original circumstance as Creator had made and left us in, and letting Ipalne Mohuani, Creator, and Tonantlaltzin, Mother Earth, Inyohame, the animals, the plants, the trees, the lands, and the various many natural expressions of life that make up the biosphere and ecoregion in which one is inhabiting, to decide whether one is truly worthy of their sacrifice. If one is truly worthy of their energy, and if they are willing to, by choice, live with you, and for you, and by you. Fear that keeps civilized man from challenging that deep, primordial civilized fear, the precursor of chaos, the impulse to act reactionarily in and from a state of fear and confusion, independently and self-preservatively, in complete ignorance and non-accordance to the natural laws and the symbiotic nature of life itself, that once maintained the health, the wealth of the collective macroorganism in which human beings only represent a lesser fraction of. And until that fear is addressed and dismantled, irregardless of the most perceived extreme or radical social movements within civilization's own constructs, one will never attain true liberation nor freedom from the cyclical and systematic pan-generational trauma, pain, and terror that is caused and sustained by this system and the means and methods by which it sustains itself. You see, relatives, one may not decolonize civilized living and civilization in the same way one may not decolonize the act of rape. The very foundation of the construct is inherently self-destructive. One must understand nepotism, greed, cyclical war, unnatural violence, hierarchy, racism, sexism, rape, slavery, social stratification, religious chauvinism, greed, unremitting environmental destruction, eugenics, pan-generational genocide, exploitation, etc. are all symptoms in which civilized man and civilized living can never be free from, regardless of the efforts or victories of even the most supposed radical thinking social movements within its own constructs. Because nepotism, greed, immorality, war, hierarchy, slavery, social stratification, racism, sexism, rape, systematic and unremitting environmental destruction of religious proportion, eugenics, pan-generational genocide, and exploitation are part of the very framework of civilized living and civilization at its very root. Understand, relatives, the act of civilization, or colonization, or domestication, so to speak, is the act of an already disconnected, unbalanced, and no longer natural entity who is no longer living in union or harmony with the natural world, whom has forsaken its own natural and original symbiotic relationship to and with the rest of the organisms that make up its own natural environment, who may now only sustain its very own survival by forcing its unnatural intent and will through brute strength, cleverness, and coercion onto less competent to defend themselves aspects of nature, enslaving them, forcibly disconnecting and inhibiting them from their own particular respective natural ecology, migratory patterns, and natural existence and natural function as native, symbiotic, interdependent natural beings, and thereby forcibly perverting them from a once natural, beneficial, and interdependent aspect of its own natural environment and ecology into now a self-destructive strain on its own natural biosphere, ecoregion, and its natural earth as a whole, all for the benefit of civilized man and civilized living, and in bane of the rest of all natural creation. You've done this to the plants you have to eat. You've done this to the lands in which were once forests, filled with its own natural expressions of life, which are now barren, cleared of its own once natural flora and fauna for the now planting of the eugenically altered crops and orchards, which serve as your food, which never satiates your ever-growing appetite and endless consumption. You've done this to the waters, diverting the rivers, the streams, tearing into the earth to access the groundwater to sustain your stone cities. You've done this to the animals and bound them in cages as slaves, disconnecting them from nature. You've done this to women, robbing them from their power, their dignity, their rightful, natural, and inherent place within the natural world and within the natural human social construct, as matriarchs, as leaders, which once maintained the balance in the natural world. And you have done this to the majority of the once natural indigenous population whose people, families, children, culture, and communities now lie in shambles, broken, disconnected, ignorant, in fear, treading water for generations in the mire of the depravity, poverty, anguish, mania, and self-hate in which colonization and a civilized state creates and sustains. Is one so foolish to believe that one's own willing participation in this way of death does not harm and warp the soul, does not create the teyol memechating, the karma, which one will have to now unknot and heal oneself from when one is finally finished playing the master's game? You see, in my language, we have no distinguishing word for the perceived notion of white man, or black man, or brown man, or a word that quantifies a human being based upon the current composition or admixture of pheomelanin to eumelanin within one's skin, as our language is deeply rooted in the realm of reality. So our words articulate the true depth of the world around us and define aspects and organisms by function, not by perceived aesthetic, which will vary depending on the eye of the beholder in a given circumstance, but by function, which defines and articulates the true nature of an aspect or organism. And the function of an aspect or organism is predicated or defined by how it relates to all of the other organisms around it or that come into contact with it that make up its own natural environment. Because of this, there's two separate words we have to describe the two opposing organisms which share the same shape and form aesthetically of what would be accepted as physically a biped human being. One is an indigenous natural human being whom is still living for the highest spiritual law and principle, in stride and in rhythm with the rest of the natural living breathing cosmos, as nothing more or less than yet another interdependent symbiotic aspect of its own natural environment and ecology, whose mere presence not only sustains but nourishes and enriches the whole of the biospheres and ecoregions in which it inhabits. This being we call Tlalchat. This is an earthly being, a natural human being in its unperverted and natural state. The other opposing organism in which shares the same distinct shape and form physically as a human being, but relates to and with all of the natural world around itself polarizingly different, is called Teypohs'weepeehl, he whom destroys his self through the destruction of all around him, a destroyer. This is a human being in a civilized state, the inverted state of a human being. So you may understand further this understanding I'm attempting to express. This is very much in the same way as when a healthy cell operates within a healthy body. It nourishes the collective body and all its systems simply by existing as it is and doing as it does naturally. Yes, a damaged cell whom has fallen out of sync with the greater consciousness in which it is supposed to be connected to and aware of and under the influence of. It then becomes a cancer cell and exploits and destroys all other cells in which it comes into contact with, motivated by fear, disconnected and believing himself to be alone. His acts are predicated upon fear, which has come to be in the absence of connection, in the absence of understanding, of context, insight. And this fear now motivates his every action, which are now all innately self-preservative and destructive to all around him. You see, as long as one remains unwhole within oneself, without balance, motivated by fear, and self-preservation, and therefore endlessly, uncontrollably, and violently in need and want from the world around oneself, a state that defines a human being in a civilized state. One will only be able to relate to the world outside of oneself from a disconnected and exploitive juxtaposition, without sympathy, without compassion, without empathy. In this, one's relationship to every other form of life external to oneself will be based upon exploitation, and one's culture, society, economy, and the construct built from this perception and relationship to the world around itself will follow the same blueprint. Because of this, there will be no peace for anyone within it, or anything that comes into contact with it. When one becomes whole within oneself, ascertaining one's taqwali, or nourishing center point, one's sacred balance, one becomes perceptive and receptive to the very sweetness and fulfillment of simply being in one's natural state and circumstance. Now, holistically aware and holistically present, not in search of, no longer in need and in want, and without fear, because one has found oneself and one's true state of being. And from this place, and in this state, one might now experience and relate to and with the whole of the entire natural living, breathing cosmos external to oneself from an entirely new scope and spectrum of interaction that comes from a place of love, gratitude, responsibility, meaningfulness, interconnectedness, compassion, depth, oneness, connection, and unyielding presentness. This is the natural state of a human being. You see, if one wishes to change the world around oneself, the only way to facilitate this process is to first work to perfect one's own internal environment, creating this paradise, this Eden within oneself, and then unpacking and sharing this paradise, this Eden, with all other forms of consciousness and all other expressions of life in which one will come into contact with. This was once our sacred way of life. This was the original instructions. My non-traditional brothers and sisters, descendants of the slaves and victims of genocide and forced cultural and genetic assimilation, heed my words carefully and keep and guard them deep within your hearts and never forget them. If one is truly seeking liberation for their people, for their children, for their descendants, seeking true freedom from systematic, unending violence, oppression, suppression, subjugation, poverty, exploitation, and every other form of terror, suffering, anguish, and destruction at the hands of one's oppressor, one must never half-step, as half-stepping only leads one to the very bowels of one's plight, never out of it. Remember, the master is not yet dead, and one is not yet free, not yet liberated, until the master's house and the master's tools have been burned and buried with him. Make no mistake, relatives, one may never experience true freedom, true peace, true health, and true wealth within a construct in which sustains itself by and through the systematic colonization, bondage, enslavement, perversion, exploitation, and destruction of the world around itself.